to introduce myself, to take a few minutes just to introduce myself. I know many of you, but some of you I've never spoken with. So just to be sure, you know, you're in the right place and with the right person. I'm Michelle Holliday. I'm a facilitator and a consultant, an author, a researcher. I work with organizations and more often these days I work with groups of farmers or with a region in tourism in trying to transition from a mechanistic worldview to a life-aligned worldview, a worldview. Oops, now I can see myself again. Chantal, is it possible to change your settings? Thank you. Thank you. Maybe I don't know, the gallery view or what's going to be good. All right. So my focus for the past 20 years has been on that shift in the guiding story we have about how the world works. And I'll talk about that a little bit more. The way I talk about it is this term THRIVABILIty, and our ability, our opportunity to create the fertile conditions for life to be able to thrive for individuals, for organizations, and communities and economies as living systems and for the biosphere. So I wrote a book about that a few years ago called The Age of Rivability, Vital Perspectives and Practices for a Better World. And I feel like this is really important. These conversations are the ones that we really need to be having. So I'm really grateful for you joining me in this conversation. So the context of me inviting you, it reminds me of my goofy grandfather, who every time he got into an elevator, as soon as the doors closed, he would turn to the other people and say, "So I guess you're wondering why I've called you all here." I feel a little bit like that. But the real context is that I'm often invited to give keynote speeches. And so I was invited in this case by a group that calls themselves R3.0. And for several years, the R in that name stood for reporting. And their focus was on corporate reporting and taking it to the next level of value and usefulness to humanity. So not only reporting to shareholders and the world what the financial results were, what the activities and the financial implications, but also sustainability implications. And so their focus has been taking that even further to have more impact and more benefit to the world. And over the past few years, they, as they dug into that work and kind of learned more about the context of it, it prompted them to change the name. It's still R3.0, but now the R stands for Redesign, Resilience, and Regeneration. And reporting is still there at the center, but it's within this bigger context of a need to redesign society for resilience and for regeneration. So that was the context in which I was invited to speak. And I said yes to speak, and then I found that I had been put into the opening session with three other speakers. There were four of us. And that session was within a track that was called Science and Behavior. And it was a little bit of a surprise for me. I wasn't quite sure why me and science and behavior, but these kinds of talks are always a great opportunity to think about how you can make a contribution, you know, to whatever that group's context is or whatever angle they're seeing for you. So it turned out that the other three speakers were really focused on science. The first speaker was a scientist who is working on the latest version of a computer simulation of the Earth. It's a world simulation model, and it's building on the work that was done first 50 years ago by Donella Meadows and Dennis Meadows, that first showed that the earth has a carrying capacity and that we're on track to go beyond it. And it's that, that computer simulation that led to the report called Limits to Growth, that was issued by the Club of Rome, and some of you will be familiar with that report. That was a landmark document and moment that really kicked off, in many ways, the sustainability movement. So that first speaker was building on Donella and Dennis Meadows' work and showing the situation now. And it's not better. It's not moving in a better direction at all. And then the other two speakers were talking about efforts to evolve corporate reporting to take into account some of that information that we get from the simulation and from other sources of data. So in particular, their evolved reporting methods take into account the thresholds of carrying capacity of the earth or of any particular local ecosystem, so that it's not enough for any company to say we're reducing our pollution by 10% if the threshold, the carrying capacity, has been overshot by 50%, you know? So let's put it into context of what the real science-based thresholds are. And the second part of this evolved form of corporate reporting is allocations. So if your company is doing the vast majority of the harm in your ecosystem, then you should be allocated the vast majority of the responsibility. So again, it's not enough to say 10%. What is it in the context? What is your action to reduce harm and do good in the context both of the thresholds and of your fair share, you know, of what's needed. So then came me, and I was in a position to speak about the connection between that science and that approach to reporting and a real meaningful change in behavior across society. So that's what I'll share with you, my thoughts about that as well. But here's what my starting point was the assumption that, or the observation that the hope of this group that I was speaking to, and I think the hope of so many of us, is that science can influence behavior. We'll see the science and we will change our behavior for the better. And so I wanted to spend some time in this space in the middle, that area of where influence happens, because clearly it's not quite as straightforward as this. And clearly it's not working as well as we hope it would. And that's why we get quotes like this one from Dennis Meadows. This is from 3 weeks ago, I think, maybe 4 weeks ago. He was interviewed by Daniel Christian Wall, and he said, "I spent 50 years trying to help people understand their realistic options and choose a bit more wisely for the long term. I would say, by and large, I have failed. I don't think the planet is going to evolve any different from my having been around than it would have if I had not been conceived." This is heartbreaking, heartbreaking. And I don't think it's true. Clearly, I'm not sure that we would be having this conversation if it weren't for him. And at the same time, and many other things as well, wouldn't be happening, and many other good things, but there is some truth to what he's saying, right? The data has only gotten more compelling, more visible, the stakes have only gotten higher, and yet we still haven't seen the massive wave of behavior change that the data would seem to warrant. And so we have to ask, what's up with that? Where is it that the science falls short of influencing behavior? So my theory, my observation is that to influence behavior, data has to land in the fertile soil of a worldview capable of integrating it. Even the most compelling...
Sorry, I couldn't quite hear you. Could you please repeat what you said?
Siri wants to know what did I say. So even the most compelling data isn't self-sufficient. It always lands within a pre-existing story and context. And for the past 50 years and now, our best sustainability data has landed in a worldview that tells us everything operates like a machine, especially our organizations, especially our companies. So that story tells us that we are separate from each other, we're separate from nature, we're separate from our organizations. It tells us that the only thing that really matters is profit and productivity, and it tells us that we exist to compete and consume. So when that compelling sustainability data lands in that story and in that soil, it simply lies dormant and unrealized, right? We can hear the data, but we can't really integrate it. We can't take it in. People are unable to imagine different ways of being. And so this data results in, too often results in minimal compliance at best, and resistance and cognitive dissonance at worst. So that's what leads to, in my view, to the stuckness that Dennis Meadows is talking about. But sometimes it does work. Sometimes the soil is fertile, and the data does lead to positive behavior change. So, for example, many of us will know of the example of Ray Anderson, the founder and CEO of Interface Carpets. And that's a company that was not a very environmentally responsible company, and transformed and is now one of the most admired companies in the world. So we have to ask, was it data? Was it the data that gave Ray Anderson what he calls a spear in the chest moment? He sadly, he passed away, but he often told the story of reading Paul Hawken's book, The Ecology of Commerce, and how in reading it, Paul convicted him as a plunderer of the earth. And that's a new story about himself and his role in the world. And for sure, there was data in the book, but more than that, there was a new worldview. Ray talked about discovering the view that theft of our children's future will someday be a crime, and that we're part of the web of life. We have a choice to hurt it or to help it. So it was that expanded story that created fertile ground for the data to be integrated and to lead to meaningful behavior change. So we can also look to Indigenous communities around the world that are widely acknowledged as wise and responsible stewards of our ecosystems. And are they wise and responsible stewards because they have access to better data? In some ways they do. They have access at least to different data, right? But it's because their worldview makes them attuned to it. The guiding story that they live within lets the data in and allows it to be integrated into more life-aligned behavior. So for us, for our little group, and for that group that I originally presented this to, what it means is that as we develop ever better data, more compelling data, and as we develop more comprehensive reporting methods, we also have to take into account the worldview that those exist within. And the good news is that a more life-aligned worldview is present and possible and growing in prominence, a worldview that is able to integrate this data and turn it into more life-aligned behavior. The challenge that we face is that worldview is not fully understood. It's not widely understood. And in particular, it's not widely understood how it's different from previous approaches. So I want to take a few minutes on that and dig into that a little bit. So on this chart, on the left side of the diagram in black, we see the progression of the mechanistic worldview. So we start on the far left with fully conventional approaches to everything. in a linear pattern of take, make, and waste. And as we started to recognize that that was causing problems, we adopted or created the green movement with things like recycling to try to do less harm. And as we saw that even that wasn't enough, we started to move into the sustainability movement and the circular economy to try to maintain a steady state, to sustain things as they were for as long as possible. But we're now starting to understand that even sustainability, even circularity are not enough, that we've done so much damage that we need to restore our natural systems and our societies. And some of us are recognizing that even more is possible, that we can work with life's inherent ability to generate itself and regenerate itself continuously over time. And that's a fundamentally different strategy. The underlying strategy is fundamentally different. In black on the left side of the diagram, these are efforts to fix the machine, to make the machine work better. These are engineering-driven approaches, and they're necessary and useful, but they're not enough, and they're not all that's possible and available to us. It's only when we start to move into a regenerative strategy that we really embrace life's core patterns and potential. So we start to cultivate what more and more of us are calling thrivability, our ability to support life's ability to thrive at all of those levels, for individuals, for organizations and communities and economies as dynamic, self-organizing living systems, and for the biosphere in all its complexity. So I think of this work as the informed intention and practice of creating the fertile conditions for life to thrive at all of those levels. Informed because if we're going to create the conditions for life to thrive, then we need to know, what does that take? What does that involve? What does that require of us? We have to get informed. And then we have to set that as our clear and explicit intention. Because if we don't get clear that life is the true bottom line and that the work is to enable life to thrive, then we'll continue to fall catastrophically short of that goal. And finally, we have to recognize that this is an ongoing practice. It's a life practice, an individual and a collective life practice of deepening in wisdom and compassion and the ability to sense what's needed and to respond with effective action. So if we start with getting informed, then I'd like to share the 4 universal design principles that I've observed in my research and in my work over the 20 years that are present in every living system, whether it's our bodies or a rainforest or an organization or a community or an economy. So these are the fertile conditions that we have to work with if we're going to enable any living system to thrive, wherever it is. So I'll share those universal design principles briefly. And the first thing we need to understand is that in every thriving living system, there are diverse parts. And those parts are connected and supported in patterns and structures of relationship in a way that enables the emergence of a new whole, a new level of life with new capabilities and characteristics that we don't find at the level of the parts. And that's the magic that we're after with a living system, right? That the whole is greater than the sum of its parts, that new things become possible. And what powers that process and makes the magic happen is life. It's whatever spark it is that animates us and makes us alive. Any living system is inherently self-organizing, self-managing, self-integrating, integrating parts into emergent wholeness, self-generating and self-regenerating, or in other words, self-healing, because it is alive. And we don't have to know really what that is, that spark, or where it comes from. We don't have to agree, but we do have to acknowledge it, that there is life that is doing the work here. Otherwise, we're left with the story that tells us we are the drivers of the machine. We are the engineers and the mechanics, when what's really needed is to shift to a story in which we recognize that we are stewards or gardeners of something precious and alive, even when it is a team or an organization or a community or an economy. So let me give you an example. I'll share a story. I work with a group of farmers in Ontario who are trying to transition to regenerative approaches to agriculture, from conventional mechanistic approaches to life-aligned regenerative methods of agriculture. And there's an abundance of science about why this transition is needed and about how they can track and report their progress along the way. There's just a handful of methods, of behaviors that constitute regenerative agriculture. So it should be pretty straightforward, right? The science should influence the behavior, and you flip the switch and there you go. But of course it's not. It's not that simple. It turns out that every piece of land is different. Every crop seems to be a little bit different. And every week seems to bring new questions and challenges. So it turns out that it's a lot more complex than it seems on the surface. And I suspect that's true for every industry and every context. So what these farmers have discovered is that they also need a community of practice and learning and support to help them find their way. And then within that learning community, what they've discovered is that this transition from conventional to regenerative agriculture really involves a change in how they see themselves and their role. So the mechanistic story told them that they were the ones, the farmer is the one that grows the plants with their heavy equipment and their chemicals. But what they're discovering is that it's actually the soil. It's the living, self-integrating, self-organizing system, the community that is the soil, that does the work of growing the plants. And so they're discovering that their role is to create the fertile conditions for life to work its magic, right? They're finding that their role is to be stewards of something precious and alive. And that is changing everything. And so with this shift in worldview and in story, now they're able to integrate the science and turn it into meaningful behavior change. And in that, they've found their way to this question that's now the focus of their work. And I find it such a powerful question. What if healing the soil and healing our relationship with soil is essential to healing ourselves, our community, and our world? This is their spear in the chest moment, when we started to really dig into this question, and it opened up the possibility to engage the rest of their community as well, the non-farming neighbors and other stakeholders. And so now real systems change becomes possible as we get down to what really matters. So if we go back to my original observation, what I told that first group that I hope they take away from my talk is that if we want our science and our data to change behavior, we have to plant it within a story of aliveness. And we probably also have to gather together in learning communities, rooted in context and together over time. So in other words, there is a worldview available, that is able to integrate our compelling sustainability data and turn it into meaningful behavior change. But it takes, and my answer to that question, what will it take? It takes that informed intention and practice. We have to deepen our understanding of what life requires. What are the fertile conditions that we have to cultivate? It takes coming together in order to find the courage to set this as our intention. It takes real courage to stand up for a different way of seeing and being. And then it takes being together in that practice and in that courage over time, and rooted in some concrete context. My experience is that it really needs to be grounded in some kind of a practice ground.